I was born on August 23rd, 1919 in Vienna, Austria. My father, Franz S.A.A. Frisch, was a bank officer and passed away when I was 10 years old. My mother, Margaret Frisch Pareda, was a high school teacher for over 40 years and raised me in Vienna. On my father's side, he was a descendant of Hungarians active in banking and early industrial management. According to family tradition, my father worked in banking, but he was also an ultra-liberal intellectual with a cynical humour similar to Verrill and other liberals of the post-Enlightenment Vienna circle. Nothing escaped his wit and sarcasm, except his deep commitment to family and his conscience. According to family history, his father spoke not only Hungarian fluently, but also German, French, Latin, classical Greek and Hebrew, the result of many years of education in a Jesuit seminary. After his time, the family's educational level deteriorated. My mother was descended from an old line of impoverished Austrian aristocracy mixed with wealthy burghers for generations. They provided high government officials with an absolute devotion to the Habsburg crown, coupled with an inbred arrogance and a total lack of humour. She taught, by choice, mainly in the poorer districts of the city, and saw no contradiction between her deep Christian religiosity, the ideals of Maria Stutner and Kudnow-Kerry, and the humanistic aspirations of social democracy. During my formative years, I grew up under what I considered the Eastern Christian fascism of Chancellor Engelbert Dölus and Minister Kurt von Schuschnigg, and studied philosophy and political economy with enthusiasm. I took these studies beyond my hobby of the time, which was tinkering with technical toys, and turned them into my profession. My youthful dream of studying law, as well as engineering and economics, was only partially successful, at least as far as paper degrees were concerned. After completing high school and the forced unification of Austria with Germany, I volunteered to participate for 7 years in Adolf Hitler's thousand-year empire. My military service culminated in 2 seemingly endless years in an American POW camp in Italy. I returned home in 1947 to begin my life anew. Those 9 years provided me with a unique opportunity to conduct applied psychological studies on human behaviour under stress on winners and losers, hopes and fears, while some of my comrades in arms regarded our campaigns in Poland, France, the Soviet Union, Sicily and Italy as a patriotic duty or a bore. I considered them an exceptional travel experience whose purpose was to study people, culture and languages. I considered this to be presumably the prerogative of an outsider like me. Long before that, I wanted to be an engineer. As long as the Austrian army existed before unification, I wanted to be an engineer officer in the army. This would have corresponded to the family aspirations. My mother's brother tried to convince me that the only value of study was law and that engineering was not worthy enough. I always had an interest in engineering, and my aversion to law came when I was told I should study it. I never counted on the German army, and I never counted on the war. I was drafted into the army in 1938, at the age of 19, along with many school and neighbourhood friends. We entered the service in the 109th All-Viennese House Artillery Regiment. By tradition, this house regiment belonged to the city of Vienna. I started as a private, a simple soldier in the German army, and remained in that rank and servitude throughout my career. Some 46 years later, with reluctance and discomfort, I agreed to tell the story of those 9 years. I had never done so before, not even to my family. I kept my thoughts to myself. I hadn't intentionally dismissed them. Basically, I'm a bit secretive. Perhaps it was the way my colleague Wilbur Jones, whom I respected as a teacher and historian, approached me that changed my mind. At the time I didn't know who might be interested in reading about my war experiences, but I realized that this would be my only opportunity to go on record. What follows are some memories of those 9 years of service to the Wehrmacht and some photographs to show that I was there. I would have taken more, but we simple soldiers could not get film after the summer of 1943. I often got sidetracked from sightseeing because of calls to action, especially while we were in retreat, so I have almost no photos of Sicily and Italy, and none of the American countryside anyway. I lost the camera I used, an American Kodak camera, and had almost forgotten what it looked like until Jones found one in an antique store in northern Michigan and gave it to me. I know that discovering the photographs I had long ignored made me more determined than ever to speak out. During my service, I did not keep a diary or find letters, but my memory remains clear despite a reluctance to think about these things for so long. I found that I repeated similar stories in different sessions during interviews. Photographs helped me remember, as did questions from my interrogator, Wilbur, who did in-depth research on my campaigns and the areas I was in to better understand what I was talking about. Translating my unit's records from German forced me to remember. I conclude these recollections with a summary of what little I have accomplished since 1947, the most notable thing being my fortune in settling in the United States. I am glad that all this is now in public. I am relieved of this burden of many years. I have always sensed a great reluctance on the part of soldiers on the losing sides to talk about what they went through, but now I wish to share it with my family, colleagues, historians and other interested readers in the hope of providing them with a clearer picture of what life was like as a German soldier. Let me say that first and foremost I fought just to survive. Of course I did. I also fought for my country, as every good soldier should, but nothing was more important to me than survival. The private, the simple rank-and-file soldier in the German army in World War II, was called Ein Soldat, which was roughly the same as a common American G.I. Joe type soldier. For 9 years I was always a private. The main reason, I think, was not my performance or my conduct, but that I had some political baggage on the family side. Before military service, I was a member of the International Boy Scouts, and was very involved with Catholicism and Chancellor Engelbert Dölus. The group I was associated with had sworn allegiance to the anti-Nazi Dölus, which for the Nazis was the same as being a communist in the United States at that time. So I entered the army with a bad political record, and was not anxious to repair it, certainly not to give in to Nazi interpretations. Staying as a private was almost predestined. Of course, at first I never thought that the service would take 9 years of my life. I thought, I have 2 years and then it's over and I'll forget this. However, it unfolded differently. My family had served well in World War I for Austria. My father was a soldier before he got sick and was discharged, and both of my mother's brothers were officers. One was captured in Russia and was in a prison camp in Vladivostok, and the other was on the Italian front. I guess it was natural for me to do my duty for my country. Compared to how I look today, military service actually changed me physically very little. I am now 5'6", about the same height I was in the war, weighed about 160 pounds during the war, not far from my present weight, although distributed differently. As a motorized soldier I always rode in a vehicle and never marched on foot. The exceptions were in 1942, after being recalled from the Russian front, when marching during training in Czechoslovakia, and in the last few weeks walking north before being captured. He was proud to be a motorized soldier. After the campaign in Poland, everyone was talking about the overwhelming success of our blitzkrieg attack, and I thought it must be the result of our intense detailed training as motorized soldiers. Despite joining the German army here with my friends from the city in a homogeneous artillery unit, what struck me early on about the army was what today we would call its diversity. Beginning with basic training, the unit emphasized an absolute geographic, social and educational mix. People recognized each other and sought a certain level of comfort, and pretty soon there were subgroups that stayed together to socialize, entertain, and for various reasons there were certain groups that visited brothels and other groups that tried to stay away and entertain differently, reading, playing chess, and so on. The German army was a melting pot, if you could call it that crossed all social and economic stratification. We heard different dialects, but the more the unit mixed, the more the dialects were placated. The advantage of this is that the men learned to understand the different dialects, and began to learn the real German language, as my German friends would say. Even we Austrians developed a common German. When I was young, you could stand 50 meters away and you could hardly understand people. This in Germany and Austria no longer exists today. Vulgar and foul language was used, probably the same as in any army, but especially when my unit was under heavy counter-battery fire in Russia and Italy. At first, in 1938, all the members of our unit were Austrians, which is characteristic of a so-called home regiment or local regiment. Each town had its own regiment. Vienna had some local regiments of infantry and artillery formed only by Viennese. Germany had similar things, such as Bavarian local regiments, etc. During the war, my unit became more and more mixed with replacement soldiers. In the end, there were no 2 home regiments left in the German army. The draftees, or drays, were called up for service in September 1938. I joined the 1st Battery of the 1st Battalion of the 109th Artillery Regiment. We were located in the military compound in Vienna called the Arsenal. The other 2 batteries of the regiment were in different buildings, and we had no communication with each other. All 3 batteries were in Poland, France and Russia from the beginning, and all 3 lost practically everything in the glorious winter offensive of 1941 to conquer Moscow. Regardless of our title, my unit was never permanently assigned to another larger organization, such as a division. We were called field artillery, or army artillery here, and were periodically transferred to a corps or division that needed immediate artillery assistance. We were never permanently assigned, as the Americans would say, to the dedicated or organic assignment system, like a fire truck sent to put out a fire, or as we used to say, where it smells bad. Therefore we were called the Fire Truck Battalion. Permanent reorganizations and unit name changes escaped the private, and we had several of them, but in essence we remained on special assignments. My artillery regiment, therefore, was a paper organization and rarely deployed as a complete unit, but rather in detachments. Therefore, as a lowly soldier who obeyed orders from corporals and sergeants, I did not always know who the generals above us were. Therefore, it is difficult for me to reconstruct exactly who we were fighting with, or to which commander we were attached in many situations. I clearly remember some divisional and corps levels that we were assigned to for certain campaigns, and one that stands out most prominently is when we were with Major General Hungarian Corps 1st Panzer Division in the invasion of France, when we chased the Allies all the way to Dunkirk. Actually, as I was translating the table of events in the sourcebook, German government accounting of Wehrmacht units, I thought about how contrary the changes were. The organizational myth of the German organizational capacity. For example, to start a revolution in an organization, revolutionaries must trust each other, and this takes time. If they are constantly moved around, there will be no trust among them, and there will be no revolution. That analogy would apply in our case. Whatever our objective, continuity of command and organization was definitely absent. This uncertainty caused some confusion and mixed signals, and, with the exception of our immediate peers, who tended to get along quite well with each other, did not improve morale. Our job was to provide artillery support for the panzer, tank, armoured and motorized infantry advancing ahead of us. We were in the 3rd echelon of advance, sometimes on the front line, most of the time a kilometre or 2 just behind it. Unlike most German field artillery units, which used horses to tow their guns, ammunition and support equipment, our guns and equipment were towed by trucks, usually CMFI half-tracks. We battery members travelled in trucks or staff cars, with some sort of convertible top most of the time. The gun we used was the 10-centimetre artillery gun, with a maximum range of 21 kilometres. Sometimes we had the 15-centimetre howitzer, which could reach 15 kilometres. Both guns used the same chassis and the same tractor to transport the ammunition. Before the Russian campaign, we designed a new identification symbol for our unit. It consisted of an Austrian shield or crest with a cross and the outline of St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. We placed it on the rear of our vehicles, to the right of the license plate. My original battery contained approximately 200 officers and enlisted men of the 109th Artillery Battalion. Actually, we were never a regiment, we had that title, but we were just a battalion. In all, we had 800 men. We were reconstituted, reformed and reinforced in Brno, Czechoslovakia, after the first Russian winter, and we received many new recruits for basic training, but no guns. We, the soldiers of the 109th, were the only unit with combat experience. After training, the 109th was split into 2 parts. The group I was with was assigned for transfer to the Africa Corps, while the other part went back to the Russian front as a new unit. Unfortunately, the unit that went to Russia was massacred along with the 6th Army at Stalingrad from 1942 to 1943, and only a few men survived. After Stalingrad, about 95,000 soldiers went into Soviet prison camps, and I think only about 4,000 came out. I lost many friends, and later considered myself extremely fortunate to be in Sicily, waiting for the American invasion that we knew was going to happen. I adapted quickly and easily to military life by learning the rules and even at a young age to keep my eyes and ears open and my mouth shut. I got along very well with my fellow soldiers. We rarely had time to go to the cities, locals for recreation time, and we ended up writing letters daily and drinking a lot. Beer and wine were generally available, especially in France, but not at all in Russia. As long as it was available to those of us who were learning to drink, even in a war you could have fun. The German army was very interested in establishing entertainment centres, which in simple language are called houses. I heard that the US Army didn't do things like this, at least not officially. In the German army, a man had to get a prophylactic injection certificate after an exposure. He had to register with the medical office, which could deter some anxious guys. If somebody got sick or something related to a venereal disease, and he didn't have a certificate, he went to jail. If he had a certificate, of course, it wasn't his fault. There were rules and regulations for every conceivable situation, and we had to know them all and adhere to them. I, for one, simply enjoyed beer and wine and played a lot of chess. We had in our group a junior master chess player from somewhere in Yugoslavia. His German was not very good, but his chess play was fantastic. Slowly and surely, we formed a small group that played chess permanently. In this group, rank did not matter. We simply enjoyed chess games. The relationships I had with my officers and NCOs were mostly careful and correct, and depended on their personalities, but in general I trusted them. Personally, I did not call a TTEN to myself or rock the boat and thus avoided extremes. Discipline became more and more relaxed. The war continued, and we all lost some of our confidence as far as military leadership was concerned, as elsewhere. In Italy, I was once assigned as a cartographer at the Artillery Battalion command post, where I made some interesting observations about our leaders. There were 3 types of leaders I noticed. Type 1, the activist, who went out early every morning to inspect the batteries and always found everything in order, forgetting that the phone announcing his visit was much faster than his car. Type 2, the braggart, who never left his command post or shelter and permanently talked on the phone with the battery commanders, knowing everything they wanted to tell him. Type 3, the human being, a wonderful man. When the situation became serious, he would show up and calm the nerves. Everyone trusted and respected him. Unfortunately, he was injured in an accident by a sentry at a rest area when he was walking at night with his dog. He was a major in the Africa Corps with the Iron Cross. I believe that all human characteristics, such as leadership, humanity, intelligence, unlearned and appearances, have a normal distribution, regardless of rank, degree, and other attributes. In other words, no human being is perfect, either on the positive or negative side. Not all officers are geniuses, and not all privates are automatons. Medical care in the German army, in retrospect, was quite good. In each battalion we had a doctor plus medical staff. If I felt sick, I had no problem showing up for a medical consultation, and I wasn't restricted. I was never really sick or had light duty. I maintained my health pretty well. We tried to take care of ourselves as best we could and helped each other. The health of the soldiers, except in desperate situations like the winter in Moscow, was mostly good. In the German army, I would say our medical care was typically European, Western style. The government provided soldiers with eyeglasses. I wore glasses and strapped them around my ears to keep them in place, and carried a spare pair in my knapsack. We had minimal eye and dental care. Like many of my buddies, I smoked cigarettes whenever I could get them. Privates couldn't get cigars, but some smoked pipes, although I never did. I didn't get the flu, just a bad cold now and then because I smoked too much. The only serious outbreak of disease occurred in Russia in 1941, when most of us had diarrhea. Unhygienic local conditions were a factor, and the quality and frequency of the food we received at the front was questionable. The other time we faced that situation in an extreme way was when we started heading north of the Gothic Line in Italy. Diarrhea is not concerned with rank, intelligence, or attributes. I had it for a few days. An example of medical care occurred during the Russian campaign in December 1941, when I suffered frostbite on my right leg while riding a motorcycle during the retreat. My leg froze a little, not too much, but enough to be recognized and require treatment. I reported to the hospital about 3 weeks before Christmas, and I was not alone. Thousands of German soldiers were disabled by frostbite and cold. The medical staff did the best they could and were happy not to be on the front line. For me, frostbite meant that I was sent home to recover in time. I knew I had outwitted the Russian winter. While I was home recovering, I had my first vacation to study for a semester at the Technical University of Vienna. I was very fortunate. It was a good break, even while I was recovering from that medical problem. It was my first time at the university, where I finally got my degree. It was a very interesting and beautiful experience, but short. At that time, The part of the 109th Artillery Regiment to which I was assigned was somewhere in Germany after returning from the front, and a new unit was being organised for the Africa Corps. I was told to report there after recovering later in Naples, Italy. In 1942 I contracted jaundice and was sent back home to recuperate, so I attended my second semester at the university during the winter of 1942 to 1943. After my leave I travelled by train and joined my new unit in Sicily. German soldiers usually received 2-week furloughs once a year, but during campaigns we were not allowed to have furloughs. In 1942 I went home on leave twice, the second time for 3 months, and once more in February 1945 for 2 weeks. The army paid for our round trip, and we used to travel by train whenever possible. From France, we went from campaign to campaign. Whether it was in France or in the Soviet Union, we were treated very well at home because we were all in the same situation. There was no discrimination, nothing like what happened to American soldiers returning from Vietnam. The universities remained open, although the number of students was extremely low. Soldiers like me temporarily occupied the student seats, and the professors, government employees, were mostly exempt from military service, especially in technical areas and in medicine. I don't know how it was in the humanities. The technology professors were allowed to stay and were part of what you might call the defence industry. The initiator of this order to study was, according to rumours, Field Marshal Hermann Göring. Somehow he determined that Germany would not have enough engineers and doctors after the great victory, almost within reach. Therefore, thanks to this strategic error in judgment, but fortunate in my favour, he ordered candidates with proven interests in those two disciplines to begin their studies at government expense. I can also naively assume that he did not know the truth or refused to recognise its importance. From the front, as when the German army began the last offensive of the war in the winter of 1941, with the goal of capturing Moscow and ending the war in the east, all before the snow came, soldiers had to have special permission to wear civilian clothes so they didn't have to go around in uniform. Otherwise, we had to wear uniforms, even in college. At home, everyone was allowed to wear civilian clothes, but I never wore civilian clothes on campaign. It was a privilege reserved for vacations. Most soldiers tried to get rid of uniforms during leave to feel like normal human beings. Of course, this was impossible, as many men were returning to cities devastated by Allied bombing raids, although in my case, Vienna was not in bad shape, except for serious rationing and other restrictions. Life in the city of Vienna was as normal as could be expected during the war. After leave, we would either return to our unit at the front or stay home, as our orders directed and our sense of duty demanded. Any decision to stay at home and try to hide meant that, if we were to go on furlough, we were caught, we were dead for sure. Men I knew, therefore, would return to their unit with great care to survive. A German soldier would return to the front to fight simply because going forward gave him some chance of survival, whereas going back to Germany or Austria was pretty much certain to be the end of life. There was the old saying, "You have to be more afraid of your superior than of your enemy." The SS did too. The superiors were afraid of being shot from the top down. With the war clearly lost in February of 1945, after my marriage, I had difficulty finding my unit in northern Italy. They were closer to Austria than I had left it. Some railroads were still functioning, but they were under frequent air raids. There was always confusion. Occasionally I would find a truck, but I would end up walking. I knew roughly where my unit was supposed to be, but communications were poor. In a strange way, the organisation of the army began to fall apart as I got closer to the front. But the closer I got to the front, the better it behaved. I would have imagined the reverse situation. The organisation at the front only fell apart on purpose when General Heinrich von Wietinghoff-Scheel and General Karl Wolff capitulated to the Americans in Switzerland in March. Up to this point, there was some kind of order on the front lines, and I wish to pay tribute to the heart and courage of German soldiers, like soldiers everywhere. We lived to receive mail from home. We received mail fairly regularly, from home to the front in 2 or 3 weeks. My girlfriend wrote to me. My mother wrote to me. As far as I know, mail was not censored by the authorities, except in the experience I relate later in this chapter, but we never knew, and fear limited what we said. We hesitated to bother people at home with details, bad as they were, because no one at home could do anything about it. The letters sent to us were mostly very short and personal. "We are fine. Don't worry about us. We love you. We pray for you. They were mainly trying to keep the bad news away from us. We had a good idea of what they were going through. The stories told by men who had been on leave were enough. In the German army there was a saying, Alles Scheiße außer Ellie. Everything is shit except Ellie. Ellie was the name of the girl who wrote to you, whatever her real name was. For some reason I never collected or sent local or war souvenirs home. Commanders at all levels of the German army also lived in fear of reprisals for not working miracles. Fear, therefore, drove the psychology of communications. There was a time when messengers of bad news were beheaded, because for our leaders, bad news had to be softened as much as possible. This I can't tell my boss, so there was an upgrading of any message from one level to the next in the command hierarchy, which I saw all the time when reporting combat conditions. After the war, I read that this psychology was practiced by people reporting to Hitler. Therefore it was difficult to get a clear picture in many cases. Communications had its secrets and mysteries. Let's take a case in Russia. I never wrote bad news to my mother. She was a widow living alone, and the radio news from the front, I thought, was enough for her. I prayed for her and tried to keep her spirits up. After about 3 weeks in the Yelna-Glinka defense area near Smolensk, I received a letter from her. At that particular time, I couldn't sleep and almost went crazy, and suddenly, at a certain moment, I was completely calm again. It turned out that she had missed the critical moment on our route of retreat from the Yelna-Glinka line by a single hour. As to what and how much we were told about the progress of the war, let me tell you that at my level we were never told what to expect. Only at the end did we know for certain what had happened. Our incoming information was continually monitored, and our outgoing information was monitored and censored. The daily news we received was highly questionable, even suspicious. It was only approved news, regardless of whether it was from newspapers or radio. It was all propaganda, and the truth was hard to find. The daily radio was the daily Völkischer Beobachter, daily of the daily Völkischer Beobachter, but filtered. News from the front was selective, always showing the positive side, and sometimes it took a long time to arrive. In the end, the best news was when some of our radio operators could communicate with the Allied news stations. We had enough personnel who understood enough English, I'm talking about Italy, to listen to the news and get some messages beyond what we were hearing for ourselves. I know that when we had a good radio at home, we made sure that the door was closed, the blinds were down, and the volume was very, very low, because we were listening to foreign news. Take the total disaster at Stalingrad, for example. I learned the truth about Stalingrad during the time I was jaundiced and received my second furlough in 1942. I followed the story of Stalingrad, a massive defeat of the Germans, at home on the radio. It took a long time for the truth to come out. This was the end of talking about the war. No one at that time believed that the war was still winnable. After Stalingrad, no one with enough intelligence believed that we could win the war. But hope was maintained by talking about the wonderful new Wunderwaffen weapons. Religion was entirely personal, and I and others prayed privately, but never openly. The opportunity to participate in religious services in the German army was relatively poor. We had services at Christmas and Easter, usually at no other time. At that time, I was a Catholic, and we attended services even when they were of different religions. Many people who attended services were the ones who could talk to me. It was a kind of a sign of trust. Around 1940, the Nazis began to attack the Catholic Church, which led to passive resistance in many quarters. In the end, we returned to the old soldier's phrase that was true in the German army: there are no atheists in the trenches. I received a salary regularly, and most of the money was transferred to my home address. We carried as many personal items as we could conceal. Officially, we had a tornister that we carried on our backs as a backpack. In our motorized unit, we always had some room to carry some personal things, but not a lot of things, mainly books. We carried writing paper, but we didn't use stamps because the postage was free. We could always find paper in the field. We had toothpaste, a toothbrush, shaving cream, razor blades, soap. Don't ask me about the quality. It was what was there. But we didn't have to buy them. They were our allowance. We were getting by pretty well. We also got a daily ration of cigarettes. We always had some friends who didn't smoke, and they would share theirs to roll tobacco into cigarettes. We mainly used newspapers to make the cigarettes. The quality of food in general, as well as clothing and personal gear, was fair to adequate. In Germany, we had something called the Feldküche, a field kitchen. The motorized units carried the Feldküche on a truck, but it was still the standard model developed at the time when we used horses to pull them. We had hot meals in Poland, France, and Italy. However, the quality of the food became cheaper in quality as the war progressed. We didn't have prepared field rations like the US Army's K rations. We ate from the kitchen or foraged for our own food. We could always find a chicken except in Russia in the winter. I never went hungry enough to eat a horse. In Russia, most soldiers carried a bag of potatoes and onions, even frozen. The food supply often stopped because of impassable roads. The popular drink was Feldküche coffee or tea, often with rum. Non-alcoholic drinks were unknown in the army. Our table equipment was the standard metal box with cutlery and knife, fork and spoon. We only had one set of uniforms and did not always receive new uniforms while on campaign. The campaign in Russia was a completely different story. We received nothing. We had no spare uniforms and had to clean and maintain the uniforms on our own as best we could. In the cold weather in Russia and Italy, it was difficult to take off clothes to clean and keep them dry and try to keep warm. Blankets were hard to find, and after a while they were just threads. When we were back in Germany or Czechoslovakia, we always got new uniforms. We had 3 sets of underwear and a pair of boots that we wore until they wore out. This was replenished on campaign. It was absolutely necessary, believe it or not. In the artillery, we wore our boots until they were worn out, even though we didn't march. WE were not issued socks. We had Fusslappen, a kind of large handkerchief, to wrap around our feet instead of socks. As for personal hygiene and sanitation, when you have been taught from a young age to keep your body clean, to use the bathroom and have a clean shirt, you always try to do it. So, I think this is true for all Western soldiers. Whether they were German, American or British, we tried to keep clean and well-groomed because we were used to it and recognized the obvious benefits of hygiene. Most units had a soldier who served as a barber. We dug our latrines and tried to wash when we could. In the artillery, we spent little time in trenches or foxholes, which required us to relieve ourselves while remaining in them like the infantry. We lived in bunkers near the front lines and went out to the latrines when we could. Try as we might, the sanitation situation became horrible if we stayed in one place for too long. The most difficult place, of course, was Russia. Once our offensive was stopped and we made progress in the initial campaigns, we were in a hurry and left what we were doing for those who followed us. Sorry, but there was no alternative. We used every skill possible to somehow bathe ourselves, but sometimes all we had to wash ourselves with was a 2-liter container of water, and we were glad when we could do even that. As for keeping a clean appearance, even if it was counterproductive, this was more for sanitation reasons than military requirements. We didn't really bathe in winter. We just washed our hands and face, sometimes our private parts. In Russia, it was almost impossible to stay clean once the temperature started to drop. To keep warm, we wore all the underwear we had, one on top of the other. In Russia, we had a lot of nits, and we were practically helpless to fight nits everywhere, a little behind the front. There were cleaning stations where we would occasionally get sprayed and take a shower to get rid of the nits. UNG Stellen's lice delousing organizations. We had to keep our uniform as clean as possible, especially during the winter. It was virtually impossible to use proper hygiene to keep clean, and we always smelled bad. We improvised as much as we could, and as artillery soldiers, we probably didn't have as bad a time as the infantry. We didn't have regular exercise periods because the war itself was exercise enough. An SS spy was in every military unit. He was a political educator, whom we called a Hausat. The term Hausat was taken from the house organization, where each house had a person as a political observer, usually the janitor. In the army, it was usually a sergeant major. This did not happen overnight, slowly and surely. This person transformed from the SA in uniform to an army uniform. The day before, he could not speak intelligently, and suddenly became the representative of the Nazi Party and carried out political education in the army companies. There were 3 rules: avoid him if necessary, be friendly, and keep your mouth shut. It worked for me. I never met the Gestapo. Once we had to take a position which the SS had conquered, and which we had to hold. The SS was gone. This was on the Yellow defense line near Smolensk, and the Russians were defeating us. As far as the reputation of the SS as good fighters, Let's say that the political indoctrination in the SS was obviously much, much stronger than in the army. Political indoctrination in the army, I would say, was practically non-existent after the fall of France. In the cafes and restaurants in Reims, SS and army officers never mixed. I well remember one instance in which I was indirectly involved with the SS in May 1942. The 109th Artillery Regiment was in Czechoslovakia training recruits. Then the partisan attack in Prague occurred when the German High Commissioner in Czechoslovakia, SS General Reinhard Heydrich, was killed. There was confusion in the compound and an immediate curfew for all soldiers the next day. We experienced Futschwein, or front pig. We were loaded onto trucks with our handguns and taken to the entrance of a small village to search for partisan weapons. We could hardly call it a town or village. It was really a collection of vine growers in a valley that stretched for about 10 kilometres. Vine-covered hills stretched along the centre and both sides of the valley. Farmers' houses were scattered on both sides of the road. Here and there, dug into the soft hills, were the farmers' wine cellars. We were ordered to search the houses and wine cellars for weapons. What a foolish idea to send a group of combat veterans in vineyards to search for weapons in a Czechoslovak village where many Austrians, especially the Viennese soldiers, had family origins in Czechoslovakia. And besides, the Austrians were not to be trusted anyway. The farmers were no fools. They invited us to taste the wine, so we went from house to house and winery to look for guns in reality, to taste the wine. A few hours later we were all very happy and drunk. We wouldn't even have recognized a gun if we had found one. An SS unit was coming after us. The local people tried to keep our men inside their houses so that the SS would leave the Czechs alone. It would have been a crime for the SS to search a house that had already been searched by the army. So we marched back to the trucks, and the search was over, and we received our well-deserved and definitely needed rest. On the general subject of mood, looking back, it's hard to assess. I was in so many places on so many fronts under such different circumstances. There were certain things we tried not to talk about. We couldn't say they were idiots and didn't know what they were doing, but most of all, we had to keep a positive attitude. If you didn't have a positive attitude, you kept quiet to stay out of trouble, which I quickly learned to do anyway. For example, in Italy in 1945, we had to keep moving northward. There was no alternative but to surrender, and we all knew that the Allies had insisted on unconditional surrender. The idea that something was wrong for the German cause was clear to everyone after Stalingrad. I don't know if anyone really believed it could be reversed. I doubt it. The American soldier was in a completely different situation. I think the American soldier had the idea that he could win the war. He may have had an ideal or a goal of winning the war, but on the German side, since Stalingrad, survival was the only goal of the individual soldier and the unit. No other goal than survival. On the Italian front against the Americans, the desired situation was one in which we could surrender. In Russia, it was a different story. In Russia, you only surrendered if you couldn't move anymore. By the way, I never heard of a German soldier deserting. For God's sake, where would he have gone? My unit and I never engaged in close combat. I never saw a live enemy soldier face to face except prisoners of war. Miraculously, I was never wounded. I have no idea why I wasn't, when everyone else was. Apparently I was targeted when serving as a forward observer, or equal to the front, and often in an extremely vulnerable position, with a very high casualty rate. All that passed me by, but I churned up the dirt and rocks around me. I carried the standard MAA infantry rifle all the time, and in Italy also a P-38 pistol. The equipment he used and operated, including the guns, was of high quality and reliability. The exception was the trucks, which I will discuss in the chapter on the Russian campaign. As for their effect on my hearing, first of all, earplugs were unknown in the German army. We tried to cover our ears as best we could. I don't know if my actual hearing problem can be traced to artillery fire or not, but I certainly heard enough cannon fire, so it is likely. My unit did not receive any medals or awards, but I myself did. As every soldier on the Russian front during the winter of 1941 to 1942 received the Winter Order and the lowest rank war service medal, and in soldiers' slang we called it the Frozen Meat Medal, or Geflügelte Schwein. It was awarded to all men who survived the first winter there, but the medal was lost shortly after the war. Thanks to my colleague in writing this memoir, who must have visited many flea markets to find it, I have the Frozen Meat Medal again, and the Kodak camera I now own. I could never get to the point of hating the enemy, stranger, but I understood them better than I understood myself. By the end of the war, I felt 100% positive about the Americans, and the Germans and Austrians seemed to me to be sort of liberators, even though they kept me in a POW camp for 2 years. There was absolutely no animosity between the soldier, American and the German soldier. I'm talking about the soldiers. The American political units and the people who came after the war had a completely different attitude. They had not fought in the war, but exaggerated their roles as victors over the vanquished. The US soldiers we fought with showed mutual respect from soldier to soldier. Perhaps it had something to do with common Western cultures, morals and basic religions. I tried to be a good soldier, to survive and avoid trouble. In short, in the spring of 1938, when the German troops arrived to annex Austria, I remembered my mother's words, "Franz, please keep your mouth shut. If you won't do it for yourself, do it for me." I became paranoid about attacks on freedom. The internal political forces in the country tended toward opportunism, but they were never dedicated to Hitler. The army in general, and we individual soldiers, always tried to keep our distance from Nazi organizations and political units, particularly the SS. I must make a brief comment about Hitler's government. An American might say that the German generals did not have the courage to stand up to Hitler, but there is something missing, something that Americans simply cannot understand. No one can understand it unless they lived under this absolute dictatorship, where they were forced to choose between the truth and their life. It's something I tell people when I talk about Europe in class. Hitler was not an idiot. He was crazy, but he was not an idiot. He didn't start by shooting people from the beginning. For example, suppose there was a manager of a big factory who was against the Nazis. Hitler didn't shoot him. Instead, he promoted him to general manager of a chicken farm at the North Pole. Who would want to be general manager of a chicken farm at the North Pole? His replacement surely wasn't interested in the same thing and quickly got the message. This gradual pressure turned the screw slowly and surely. No one realized it at the time, until it was too late. This is not in any book. There is no analysis. Everyone talks about atrocities where they can take a picture and statistics about the millions. So much for today's video. Remember to subscribe and leave your like so we keep bringing content for all of you. See you next time.